Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our June. Hold the phone. Hello, Tom. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. And thanks to all of you for joining us for our June Lunchtime Lecture series. If you've been a frequent attendee, you know that we were supposed to be welcoming Judge Dollinger a month ago. He was worth waiting for. We subbed in at the last minute a great speaker, Professor Robert May, and we're grateful that Judge Dollinger was able to reschedule with us for today's program on the Irrepressible Conflict speech. If you're a fan of Hamilton, you probably have and can hear in your heads the room where it happened bouncing around. What if you could have been in the room where it happened when William Seward gave his Irrepressible Conflict speech? If you're Thurlow Weed, an advisor, you think maybe this is the speech that sinks his presidential ambition. If you're his wife, Frances, you're thinking, finally, he's found his abolitionist voice. The truth may be somewhere in the middle, and we are so pleased to welcome Judge Dollinger today, who's been studying this and going to put it into greater context for us, local, state level. I would be remiss if I didn't share with you that, of course, we have another lunchtime lecture coming up next month, more at the end, but also two great programs. This very Friday, for free in the gardens, we have our Seward reenactor, Jack Sherman, going to be reading some of William Seward's famous 4th of July speeches.
Speaking of that,
there he is now, Mr. Seward. And a performance from the Auburn Civic Band. Come for Jack, stay for the music. And then you're going to say a few words about the concert, Lily?
I would love to. And then coming up on Thursday, July 16th, we have our second installment of classical music in honor of Auburn's own Rebecca Carr. Rebecca was an opera singer with the Philadelphia Academy, and born and raised in Auburn, moved back here, sadly passed a year ago, and this series was endowed on her behalf. We had the first series musical event last November. This one on the 16th is outdoors, so in the garden, and we have folks from the Ithaca Shakespeare Company, the Trumansburg Shakespeare Company. So we have a baritone, a soprano, and a pianist. We're going to start the evening with a prelude reception, if you're interested in that. And then the music will start at 7 o'clock outdoors in the garden. We have flyers. Everything's up on our website. It's going to be a beautiful, magical evening. Thank you.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank, you don't mind, Walker, you don't mind if I occasionally wander, right?
You can wander. You're free to wander.
Okay, I'm free to wander. That's a dangerous thing to allow a politician to do. You know, you never know. First of all, I want to thank Jeff and Walker for the invitation, as well as the board of the Seward House for the invitation to come in. I apologize for missing. Please come forward if you need a seat. Okay, you've got one back there. I apologize for missing the May event. I had a little health intercession, but I'm fine. So I got through that. And it's a tremendous privilege for me to come out and salute William Seward. I thought about it on the way over here and realized that New York has sent a series of legends to the United States Senate. Before we direct elected them by virtue of the constitutional change in the early 20th century, they were all appointed by the state legislature, and they went through the politics of the state legislature. Since then, we've elected some of the real lions of the United States Senate. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Robert F. Wagner. We also elected a couple carpetbaggers, as you might call them, people that weren't born in New York. Most recently, of course, Hillary Clinton, and then, of course, Robert F. Kennedy. But I'm going to let you in on a little secret. William Seward was the only United States Senator from New York who was born in Florida. You can believe it. That's the little tiny town in the Catskills where his family was from. But it just adds another dimension to it. The last thing I want to do is I have a quiz for everybody in this room. I'm going to talk today about Seward's speech and how it had an impact across the nation, but more importantly, right here at home. And when I get to the end of this presentation, I'm going to ask you a question. A great political philosopher in the last 100 years gave the theme of what I'm going to talk about today. He was an elected official. He was from all places. Actually, I once voted for him because I lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm going to ask you who that philosopher and politician was, and I hope I can convince you that you can give me the right answer. That's the question at the end of this presentation. When we talk about William Seward and the, oops.
This thing's so touchy, it's not your fault.
See what happens, I immediately begin to talk and technology fails. Okay, the first thing I want to call to your attention, because it's going to be part of our discussion today, is this is a very unusual word. Irrepressible. I've heard a number of people describing it as the irresistible speech. I'm going to explain to you why Seward cleverly used that word instead of irresistible when we get to the end. Okay. He's a master of New York's fusion politics in the middle of the 19th century, and his political past is evidence of that. Seward starts as a third-party candidate. Was that in? Okay. He's elected, interestingly enough, under the Anti-Mason Party. The Anti-Masons. It's funny, I always wondered whether there were Uncle Masons, but I guess just Anti-Masons. But they were a fashionable party after the death of William Morgan raised the issue of secret societies. New York launched an anti-Mason party in response. He joins the Whig Party in 1834. The anti-Masons had really ceased to function at that point. He's governor during the anti-rent war of 1839. You may recall that he actually summoned militia to deal with the anti-renters in the wake of the controversy in the Hudson Valley. There were anti-renters elected. This is a third party. This is a group of people who got together because of the better? Okay, part of this is in the dark, so anyway. And Seward eventually joins the Republican Party after his election in 1855. His first statewide election comes about in 1834, and in the gubernatorial election, he runs against William L. Marcy. He loses. He gets 48% of the vote. The interesting thing about it, of course, by then, he was associated with Cayuga County, but he couldn't carry his home county. He was 33 years old. He was considered much, much, much too young to be the governor of the state of New York. And sure enough, what shows up is in 1838, he runs for governor again, and he beats Marcy this time in 1838. Although, can't seem to win Cayuga County. I don't know, maybe his neighbors knew something about him that the rest of New York did not. Anyway, he wins that race by a narrow plurality. It's a close race. Slavery begins to raise its head in the early stages. And if you look at this in the 1838 race, there were three items that were considered important in this race. The first was the right of blacks to a jury trial when confronted with a fugitive slave issue, the freeing of slaves who were brought to New York on a moment's notice and eliminating the delay when that would occur. And the final thing, of course, please take a seat. There are seats up here. And we can make more. There's a couple over there. All right. And what's interesting about these, Marcy, who was the Democrat who held the governor's office, was opposed to all of these. Seward only favored the first. He thought, as a good lawyer did, that you needed a constitutional amendment to enact black suffrage, and it was something that the legislature and he could not do. Interestingly enough, The abolitionists endorsed a man named Luther Bradish, who was the Whig candidate for lieutenant governor, who supported all three of these proposals. What you begin to see is that the political parties are beginning to break in pieces over the issue of slavery, even in 1838. Interestingly enough, Seward, after he becomes governor, where are we here? I want to make sure my slides don't get too far ahead of me. He does win. This is the results of his race in 1838. He still loses his home county in Cayuga County. We've got that. After he's elected, he begins to move in a direction that the abolitionists might consider worthy of a vote. He signs legislation to guarantee jury trials to fugitive slaves. He repeals the 9-month allowance. The law in New York, by this point, New York had outlawed slavery in 1827, and they had a rule that said if you came to New York and you stayed for more than 9 months, then your slave would be considered free. And the question was whether you had to wait the 9-month period. He repealed that allowance, that 9-month allowance, and made it immediate, which of course leads to the Lemon cases, which we'll talk about eventually. And he gave state support to gain freedom for free blacks who were kidnapped and sold back into slavery. The final thing he did was establish public education for all children. But what's interesting about that did not create desegregated schools in New York. That came about by virtue of individual school districts deciding that black children had the same right to a public education as whites. In the late 1850s, the city of Rochester became the first school district that actually abolished segregation and created a universal school district for all. Seward's last statewide election, he runs for governor again, and he defeats William Garrett Smith. If you recognize that name, anybody recognize the great abolitionist Garrett Smith? At the time, he was reputed to be the wealthiest man in the state of New York. He lived in upstate New York. He ran under the Liberty Party designation. We'll talk about that later. But the important thing to keep in mind is Seward's margin in the 1840 election is a mere 5,400 votes. It's a close race. It comes right down to the wire. President Harrison, William Henry Harrison, ran as the Whig candidate for president. He got many more votes than Seward did. And bottom line is, by 1840, the Whigs were not a strong statewide party, and Seward wasn't a particularly strong statewide candidate in 1840 as well. Then we get to Seward's elevation to the United States Senate. Of course, he had served in the state Senate. He's elected by the legislature by an overwhelming majority because he is involved in the formation of the Whig Party, which begins to accumulate some abolition votes, some disgruntled Democrats. The anti-Masons, the anti-rent folks are all looking for a political party as an alternative to the Democratic Party, which had been run basically by, interestingly enough, the only member of the New York State Senate ever to be elected President of the United States. Who was it? Martin Van Buren, the only member. I served in the Senate myself for 10 years. It's interesting. There was one other member of the New York State Senate who did serve as President of the United States. His name was Franklin Roosevelt. When I was in the Senate, the first day I was there, I kept trying to find the desk that had FDR's initials carved underneath it. I couldn't find it, so I never got that opportunity. But in essence, in its elevation to the Senate, he wins by a huge margin. So this is in 1849. He gets designated under the system that we had at the time, which was the legislature elected members of the United States Senate. It's time to take a look at the politics of 1850 in New York. And the anti-Masons are gone, the anti-renters are gone. A Free Soil Party is formed in Buffalo. It's anti-slavery and it's a spin-off of the Democratic Party. Martin Van Buren was the candidate of the Free Soil Party in 1848, and he got 10% of the national vote. This is a completely new party, never been on the ballot before. He gets 10% of the national vote, and in New York State, he gets 27% of the statewide vote for president. He's a former Democrat. He's a leader of the Democratic Party when he's elected president in 1840. And sure enough, in 1848, by 1848, he has spun off into the Free Soil Party, largely because the Free Soil Party is anti-slavery, and Van Buren is with them. So what you see is the continuing fracturing of New York's politics. Also in 1852, when the presidential election is run again, Franklin Pierce of New Hampshire wins New York with barely 50% of the vote. But the Free Soil candidate for president gets 5%. In essence, you see the shifting loyalty of New York's voters as they're moving from one party to another during the period of the 1840s, late 1840s and the early 1850s. The Liberty Party and the Know-Nothings are right on the fringe. They're about to jump in a big way in New York. And of course, you have the radical abolitionists waiting in the wings as the 1850s dawn. I wanted you to see what the picture looks like of governors in the period of time from 1840 to 1854. And as you will see, there were Democratic candidates and Whig candidates who won. And then Myron H. Clark, who wins in 1854 as a combination of the Whigs and the Free Soil Party. He's a fusion candidate. And that's what we begin to see in New York, is someone who's going to win statewide office needs to be able to fuse these minor political parties into a single movement to win. And the bottom line is this: United Democrats can win, but Whigs aligned with Free Soilers can win. And this is when the slavery issue begins to devour New York. I wanted to show you this cartoon. You probably can't read it all, but it appeared in the 1850s, and the characters, just so you can see them. This is Wilmot. If you know anything about the Wilmot Proviso, which was an 1850 congressional move in an attempt to deal with the issue of slavery in the new territories. This is Garrison, who's a well-known, William Lloyd Garrison was a well-known abolitionist. This is Calhoun, of course, who's the Southern voters. And this is Greeley, Horace Greeley, who was kind of a middle-of-the-road, couldn't find an allegiance in the political process. But the metaphor that they're using here is the old line from Double, Double, Toil and Trouble, which starts what? Famous? Macbeth. Double, double, toil and trouble, in the cauldron, boil and bubble, fill it of a fenny snake, in the cauldron, boil and bake. Macbeth. And this is the fight over the fireplace that is a demonstration of how New York's politics are at a hard boil. The other thing I just wanted to mention, there's another group here, Foyerism. Does anybody know what Foyerism is? Foyerism was a utopian idea that came to the United States. You're probably familiar with the United community that existed in Oneida County. They saw peace, they saw tranquility, free love, no marriage, do whatever you want. Foyerism was another factor in New York's politics, based on a simple political theory, which I never thought had much vitality, but the theory was simply, why can't we all just get along? It didn't quite work. 1854 comes, and the cauldron of New York politics continues to boil. And this is an important slide in understanding what happens in New York. Myron Clark is the Whig candidate. Horatio Seymour, may have heard that name before, is the Democratic candidate. This is the closest race in the history of New York's gubernatorial races. This race is decided, as you can see, by less than 400 votes out of almost 500,000 cast. Clark wins, but just barely, just barely. And the reason why he wins is because the Democratic Party has now completely split New York. He, the Democratic candidate, Horatio Seymour, is what they call a hard Democrat. The hard Democrats were pro-slavery, and they did not want to reconcile with other Democrats. They were strongly pro-slavery. There was another group of Democrats called the soft Democrats. And the soft Democrats believed that in order to get together, we should unite with the hards and come up with a, quote, a soft position on the issue of slavery. We'll find out that there is no soft position on the issue of slavery, but they wanted to reconcile for the purpose of winning statewide elections, right? If you're in a political party and you want to win, I have a simple theory for politics. It's really simple. It's only about one thing and one thing only. Vincent T. Lombardi. Winning isn't a good thing. It's the only thing. That's true in politics as well. That's what the Democrats in the 1950s were beginning to experience, was that the fracture between the hards and the softs in the Democratic Party had created an opening for Whigs. The interesting thing is, I just wanted to call your attention, the voters are in disarray at this point. As you can see, the Free Soilers, the Know-Nothings, the Temperates, the hard and the soft Democrats, and the Whigs, New York's politics are cut into as many slices as you have in a pizza. It's impossible to figure out where the majority in New York stands. Anyway, this is the politics. What happens is the elections, the statewide elections for the legislature, there are a whole bunch of Whigs, they're hards, they're softs, and they're even temperance people. Temperance people, let's get rid of the alcohol, right? And they were elected for the session of 1855 to the New York State Assembly. I had to call your attention to one person because he's kind of an interesting figure here, and that's Daniel Ullman. As you can see, he got almost 30% of the vote in the 1854 governor's race. He was a Whig. He had one opponent that he could never stomach. He hated William Seward. And he really made his name as a Whig, championed the fact that you vote for William Seward to become a United States Senator again, you are wasting your vote. It was a fracture right there, even in the middle of the 1850s. Ullman goes on to become a general in the Civil War, and he achieves a status that most thought probably wasn't possible. He becomes the first general to lead an army of African-American soldiers for the Union Army. Just an interesting and fascinating guy as a footnote. And what happens? As a consequence of the 1854 election, remember, razor thin, 300 votes, 400 votes separating the gubernatorial candidates, there's a surge in the know-nothings who suddenly come out of the woodwork. The know-nothings have two political positions. One is they're vehemently anti-immigrant. We don't want those Irish guys coming through Ellis Island anymore. Choke it off. Stop immigration. We don't want anybody from Eastern Europe. We're tired of having people wandering around, undercutting our wages, taking our jobs. If you know anything about current politics, that might sound familiar. But the Know-Nothing Party was really based on the notion that immigrants were a threat to America. And the other thing that they were strongly opposed to, they were anti-Catholic. They were strongly against the religious experience of Catholics in America. Anyway, in the 1854 election, they know nothing, Daniel Ullman, They really had no serious organization in the state. They were the newcomers to the state. In the wake of their success, getting 120,000 votes in New York, they established a national party called the American Party. And the American Party becomes a huge success. Supposedly, according to the best available numbers, they grow from 50,000 members in 1854 to more than 1 million 2 years later, nationwide. The know-nothings are on the march. And what's critical to understand is they're strongly anti-slavery. And sure enough, the slavery and the abolitionist issue in New York starts to come to the fore because the Know-Nothing Party is the major third party. The Know-Nothings, in combination with either Whigs, the Whigs win. If they go in combination with the Democrats win. They are the swing party in New York in the 1850s. What happens? William Seward comes up for re-election to the Senate. Again, remember, this is done through the state legislature in 1855. Turns out the Whigs control both the Senate and the Assembly, and Seward wins. But remember, when he's first elected in 1849, he gets 82% of the legislative votes. He's been in the United States Senate for 6 years. How many votes does he get? He gets just barely 52%. Because the legislature has begun to fracture just the way the general public has. There are hard Democrats who get 14 votes, 10%. There are soft Democrats who get 9%. And suddenly the legislature looks like New York's voters. It's completely fractured. And so Seward wins again. But President Millard Fillmore from Buffalo, wants to go to the United States Senate. He's in the mix as the Know-Nothing candidate. What does this tell you about William Seward and his grasp on his Senate seat in New York? He's in trouble. He's in trouble. His once lock-solid grip on his Senate seat is in trouble, and there's one other corollary to that. And what is that? The ability of a Whig to carry New York in a presidential election is suddenly at issue because of its fractured politics. And what happens, and this is sort of the interesting thing. Back in the 1850s, other than the governor's race, all the other statewide races, and there were a whole bunch of them, the canal commissioner, the state engineer, an inspector of the state prisons, they were all elected in an off-year election. They weren't elected in the even number year. They were elected in the odd number year. So there were statewide races in 1857. There are no polls, but they're frequent statewide elections. You can see what's beginning to happen by looking at the in essence, the off-year elections. And you get to 1855, all right, and sure enough, what happens? The Know-Nothings, the most amazing and surprising election victory in the history of New York, they win 8 of the 9 statewide offices. The Know-Nothings, who were nothing 2 years earlier, suddenly win 8 of the 9 statewide races. And what happens is the legislature ends up fractured. Look at these numbers. In the Senate, 16 Republicans, 11 Americans, 11 Know-Nothings. In the Assembly, 47 Democrats, 44 Americans, Know-Nothings. Party hadn't been formed until 2 years earlier. And in essence, there's a chaotic situation in New York where the Know-Nothing Party, the early abolitionist party, now has leverage over New York's elections. The Know-Nothings have proven that with their support, they can elect statewide candidates. We get to 1856, when the presidential vote occurs, and sure enough, what happens? The Know-Nothing Party, the American Party, puts forward Millard Fillmore, the retired president of the United States, as its candidate, And Fremont, the Republican who was somewhat ambivalent about the slavery issue, he wins New York, but just barely, because the Know Nothing Party nominates its own candidate and draws 124,000 votes. Just look and realize that if they had nominated the Democrat, he would have won easily. New York's fusion politics are now dependent on the Know Nothing Party. And just to give you a sense of why would William Seward go to Rochester to give a speech about emancipation and abolition, take a look at these numbers. Where are the votes for the Know Nothing Party coming from? I mean, I don't think I need to give you a geography lesson, but not one of these counties, with the exception of Schenectady, is anywhere in the eastern part of New York State. The abolition movement is alive and well, and voters are turning out to vote for abolitionists in western New York. This is where the seeds for the issue of the Irrepressible Conflict speech evolved, because upstate New York is voting largely for abolition. Whether it's the work of Frederick Douglass or others, we could talk about that, but the hotbed of the abolition vote is in western New York. In 1856, the vote for governor, this is the same time while Fremont is running for election. Interestingly enough, the Republican wins, but he only gets 44% of the vote, because the Know Nothing candidate gets 22% of the vote for governor, more than a fifth. 1 out of every 5 voters is not voting for the primary party. They're voting for the abolitionists, for the Know Nothing. John King, who's the first Republican governor of New York, he gets fewer votes than Fremont got as the presidential candidate. But what's interesting about it is the Know Nothings have already established themselves as the critical player in New York politics. 1857, along comes the decisive blow in favor of slavery in the Dred Scott decision. If you're not familiar with it, the Supreme Court of the United States held that African American slaves were not persons under the Constitution, and as a consequence, they had no right to bring an action in federal court. The Supreme Court of the United States declared the Missouri Compromise that cut the nation in half, slavery in the South, free land in the North. That was declared unconstitutional. And as the Compromise of 1850, which allowed Missouri to be admitted as a state and Maine to be admitted as a state to keep the balance in the United States Senate, that was suddenly suspect, because that was also based on the issue of preserving the slavery content of the United States. In essence, just about everything is thrown into turmoil by Dred Scott, because, as we will see in a second, what happens to compromise? Where does compromise go in the United States Senate? How do we deal with it? I would point out one other thing. There were a series of cases brought in New York. They're called the Lemon cases. And what they involve is a slave owner from Virginia came to New York and stayed in New York for 30 days. Under New York law, those slaves were now free because they had lived in a free state for 30 days. It went up through the chain of courts in the state of New York, eventually went to the New York Court of Appeals, which in fact held that they were now free. That case was never tested under Dred Scott. In my opinion, as a lawyer and former judge, I would tell you that the Lemon cases would have been overturned by the Supreme Court, because even if your property was brought to New York, you don't forfeit your property. And because slaves were considered property and not persons, the Lemon cases and the decision in New York's ability to outlaw slavery, as it did in 1827, was inconsistent with the decision in Dred Scott. Slavery would have been allowed in New York. The Supreme Court, they're led by Roger Taney, who was a slaveholder himself from Maryland. A famous guy, the brother-in-law of an even more famous guy that you've all heard of. He was Francis Scott Key's brother-in-law, the guy who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. The court was almost entirely made up of Jacksonian Democrats, and I believe the majority of the court were slaveholders. So the decision in Dred Scott is nothing that, in my opinion, should surprise anyone. And I think under all the circumstances, no matter what your view, the court's decision probably has more legal justification than most people realize. Right from the start with the three-fifths decision, African Americans were not considered persons under the Constitution. They weren't counted as persons. They were counted as persons to give some semblance of voting power, but it was only 3/5. So Dred Scott, nonetheless, Dred Scott really puts the kibosh on the issue of compromise. And that brings us partly to why was it impossible? Well, Dred Scott could only be overturned by, of course, appointing new judges who believed in emancipation and abolition. If a Democrat had been elected president of the United States, that wasn't going to happen. James Buchanan, who was the sitting president at the time, had no interest in doing it. He was a strong supporter of the Southern slave rights, so that wasn't going to happen. The other thing to keep in mind is a constitutional amendment. I assume everybody knows the constitutional amendment process. It requires that 2/3 of the House and the Senate have to vote in favor of a constitutional amendment. At the time of the American Civil War, there were an equal number of senators from the South and the slave states and an equal number of senators from the North. Explain to me how you get to the 2/3 idea when half of the people in the room own slaves. And then the other interesting thing, of course, is assuming that it did. A miracle happens and the Congress passes a constitutional amendment. It requires the approval of 3/4 of the states. There were 11 slave states. How many states would you need to pass a constitutional amendment to abolish slavery if 11 states voted against it? You would need 44. When did the United States admit its 44th state? Just before the turn of the 20th century. Late 18s, I believe, Wyoming may be the 44th state. We would have waited forever for a constitutional amendment, assuming it could ever get through the Senate. The point is, it's simply not. Compromise is not going to be possible. And a couple other things happened. We'll run through this quickly. In 1857, after the presidential election, remember, where there are statewide ballots, their whole Democratic state tickets, all the Democrats were elected. Why? James Buchanan comes to the conclusion that the best thing he can do to elect a new Democratic president is to tell the hards and the softs in New York that their feud is pointless. It's time to get Democrats back in the same party, which he is. And he uses all kinds of political favors to do that. He doles out the inspector of customs in New York City. He divides the patronage benefits, and he brings the Democrats back together. And sure enough, the 8 statewide offices, they all elect Democrats, and the American Party, and again, this is what is to be kept in mind, they get 15% of the vote, all right? And they swing, but the bottom line is they change the configuration of the legislature. Republicans and Democrats are nearly split. And by 1858, it's fair to ask the question, is New York a Democratic or a Republican state? They have a Republican United States Senator, and he's got to deal with that. Who's looking at New York in 1858? Well, William Seward is, right? He's rumored to be a presidential candidate, and he either wants to be the kingmaker or he wants to be the king. And he's also worried about his reelection, right? He's got to consider that in 1861. The Democrats are focused on it. Buchanan and Douglas, who's the presumptive candidate at the time, Can they bury the hatchet over Kansas and Douglas's notion of popular sovereignty? And then you have the abolitionists, the American Party, which is the anti-slavery party. But they question, is the new Republican Party a compromise party? Or are they solid on the issue of abolition? It isn't quite clear. Because William Seward, their leader, was compromising when he ran for governor last time. And Seward's commitment, even though Seward speaks strongly against the Kansas-Nebraska Act and in the Senate voices strong views about abolition, the American Party, the know-nothings, are concerned. So, where do the abolition votes in Western New York go in 1858? That's really the question, and here's what we find out. Is that it? Who's looking? We did that. Okay. Let's look at this. And what's interesting about it is there were candidates vying for the Democratic nomination, but Buchanan intervenes, and he gets them to back a man named Amasa J. Parker, who could unify them and had run 2 years earlier. He had lost to King, but he was close. Remember that? And sure enough, the hards and the softs are united. So in 1858, it looks like the Democratic Party is completely united, and they're ready to take back the governor's office. What are the Republicans doing? Well, there's a convention in Syracuse, and the Republican Party holds its convention in the same city at the same time with the know-nothings, because they need the know-nothing votes to win against the United Democratic Party. Thurwood Weed, Seward's right-hand man, I think it's fair to say, he's running the convention. He's trying to get the know-nothings to endorse the Republican candidate for governor, Edward D. Morgan. Well, it doesn't work out. They abandon the idea. They can't put the coalition together. And the proposed ticket that the Republicans wanted, the new Republican Party, fails to attract the American Party votes. And they nominate Lorenzo Burroughs, who's interesting. He was elected on the American Party ballot in a statewide election 3 years earlier. He's a formidable candidate in 1858. But the key to all of this is William Seward and the Republicans know that without abolition votes, they're going to lose. It's that simple. Parker commits a couple faux pas in an attempt to try to bring, he's solidly Democratic. And what does the Democratic Party believe? Abolition is a waste of time, according to Parker. So he alienates all the know-nothing voters. And he says they're basically thinking more of carrying out their ends than serving the Union. He's a Union guy. Keep the Union together at the cost of slavery. That's Parker's message. And then he does one other thing. He talks about abolition, and he goes to a meeting in New York City where he's the keynote speaker, and the other keynote speaker is a man named John C. Calhoun, who's a slaveholder and the leader of the rebellious state of South Carolina. I don't think there's any doubt that Parker did not do himself any benefits during the course of the campaign. Seward comes to Rochester on October 28th, 1858. What's he thinking? What is the issue for Seward? Well, he needs abolitionist votes to win. He's got to figure out how to bring the abolitionist votes. The abolition votes are concentrated in Western New York. He's not going to give this speech in New York City. He's going to give it in Western New York. He knows that congressional compromise on the issue of slavery is impossible. It'll never happen. It hasn't happened yet. The Senate is evenly split. There's no chance for compromise. In order to be considered a presidential candidate, the king or the kingmaker, he knows he needs to get New York's electoral votes for a Republican in 1860. New York has 35 electoral votes. You need 152 to win. 20% of the electoral votes to win in 1860 are coming from New York. He's got to be able to deliver, if not for him, for someone else. He also knows that in the state of Illinois, There's a former weak congressman running around in a debate saying not that we're going to abolish slavery, but who instead quotes the Bible and says, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." Abraham Lincoln campaigns in Illinois and says, we're not going to interfere with slavery in the South. We're going to prevent its expansion to the West, but we're not going to interfere with it in the South. And why does Lincoln do that? Lincoln is running in Illinois. In southern Illinois, there are slave holders who are voting for members of the state legislature, and Lincoln needs the votes of the state legislature if he's going to become the next United States senator. Sure enough, what happens is that Lincoln's approach, keep slavery in the South, will not satisfy abolitionists. They know that, and garner their votes. The failure to create a unified statewide ticket is proof that the abolitionists are not going to jump on the Republican bandwagon unless the leading Republican comes to Rochester, New York, and says this. Is that part of the irrepressible speech? Yep. This is the irrepressible conflict speech. This is the critical piece. But it's an irresistible conflict between opposing and enduring forces. And it means that the United States must either sooner or later become entirely a slaveholding nation or a free labor nation. Compromise will not free the enslaved, only conflict. The only ability for voters to influence that conflict is to vote Republican. That is Seward's message. And he comes to Rochester because that's the home of the abolitionist movement in upstate New York. He comes because he needs to know he's going to convert abolitionist votes in the 1860 and 1858 presidential election. Seward's bottom line is this. It's a very interesting speech from the point of view is he really doesn't mention a lot of names. What he keeps saying is the Democratic Party is the slave power. If you want to end the slave power, you cannot vote Democratic. The only way to end the slave power is to vote Republican. And other issues, interestingly enough, he talks about them, temperance, women's rights to vote, immigration. What he basically says is quite simple. These are not the big issues of the day. Until we solve the slave problem, we cannot solve those issues as well. They have to wait until we conquer the slave issue. And futility, talks about the futility of waiting any longer. Question?
No.
Nope. Waiting any longer. It's not pointless to wait any longer. Now is the time for America to face this choice between either a free labor union or the consequence of the slave power. All right. Does it work? All right. Seward's bottom line, we talked about that a second ago. Seward's appeal in Rochester, that's really the question, does it work? Here's what happens. In the 1858 election, it works. And why does it work? Don't pay attention to the votes for Morgan. Pay attention to the votes for the American Party candidate, Lorenzo. It goes between 1860, when the American Party candidate got 120,000 votes, Lorenzo Burroughs, remember, who was elected statewide as the comptroller in 1856 and 1858, he gets half of the votes that the American Party candidate, the Know-Nothing candidate, got 2 years earlier.
You were talking about earlier about how they had to deal with the issue of slavery first. How are they able to deal with the other issues following the end following what they had to do with slavery?
I didn't hear the rest of it. Sorry.
How are they able to deal with the issues that you were talking about, like women's rights, temperance, stuff like that, following the end?
From Seward's point of view, any effort to attend to those issues was a waste of time, because until the slavery issue was resolved, till the fundamental union question of whether we had a union, a single country with a single view of on the issue of slavery, until that was done, the other issues, temperance, women's right to vote, which, as we all know, both got original constitutional protection, right? 19th Amendment, women's right to vote, 18th Amendment, the banning of alcohol and the temperance question. They eventually made it to the agenda of the United States.
To the end of slavery first.
And without an end to slavery, the Union does not exist. That is the message of William Seward. And until we confront it as part of the irrepressible conflict, and it's what's fascinating about it, I looked up the word irrepressible because I thought he would use the word irresistible, right? No, it's irrepressible. Why does he use the word irrepressible, and what's the difference between those two words? He knew that the war had already started. In Kansas, it was burning. The question of popular sovereignty, which had been the dogma of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, which Seward voted against, the dogma of popular sovereignty was that the new states would decide for themselves whether they're going to ban slavery or not. What happened in Kansas and Nebraska is that the southern states flooded the states with pro-slavery people. The northern states flooded the state with anti-slavery people, and they started shooting and killing each other. The war had already started, all right? What is also interesting as a little footnote based on other research that I've done, where did John Brown come to recruit people for the raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859? He stopped in Rochester, New York to meet with Frederick Douglass. He was roaming around Western New York because he knew it was the home of the abolitionist voters, that William Seward was desperate to get to vote Republican. And it was only when he declared that the Republican Party is the abolitionist party and we are out to destroy the slave party, it's only when he does that the votes begin to change. And sure enough, that's what happens in the 1858 gubernatorial election. In 1859, the same fusion party exists. The interesting thing is, in this contest, the American Party, the Know-Nothings, decided that they would split their allegiance. They gave some endorsements to Democrats and some endorsements to Republicans. And what's interesting about this is all the cross-endorsed candidates won, Democrats and Republicans, because they had know-nothing votes. And what's also interesting about it, when you come up with the totals together, look at how close it was. The Republican Party had 251,000 statewide votes. The Democratic Party had 227,000, and the American Party had 24,000. I'm not a math guy. We got math people here, right? Can you do the quick math? They're exactly the same. New York is completely split between the power of the Democrats and Republicans and the reliance on the know-nothing votes. That's the result of, again, the 1859 statewide election. And then we get to 1860, and sure enough, what happens in 1860? Abraham Lincoln wins. There is no American Party candidate on the New York ballot. It's a choice between the Democratic fusion candidates of Douglas and Bell and Breckinridge. As you may know, the Democrats split all over the place with the Union Party, the Democratic Party, the Southern Democrats. It completely splits. Abraham Lincoln gets 53% of the vote to win. And again, from the point of view of the know-nothings, he's a soft abolitionist, right? Keep it in the South, don't let it go to the territories, but we're not going to get rid of it. He basically survives, and what's interesting about it is in the upstate counties that were casting votes for the Know-Nothing Party, vote overwhelmingly for Abraham Lincoln. Seward has pulled it off. He has convinced the Know-Nothing votes that you can vote for a Republican and they will not compromise on the issue of the abolition of slavery, even if their preferred candidate in Abraham Lincoln is a little soft on the question. And what's interesting is Seward also knows, of course, that his re-election to the Senate is assured because the Senate and the Assembly are both in favor of the GOP. He has to go back in 1861 and get their votes again if Lincoln does not win. So his own seat is preserved. He's brought New York into the win column. And here's the mirror image of that. In my opinion, had Seward not given the Irrepressible Conflict speech to drive abolitionist votes in 1860 to Abraham Lincoln, what would have happened is, if Lincoln does not win New York, he doesn't have a majority of the electoral vote because it's fractured among 3 other candidates. What happens if no candidate gets a majority of the electoral vote in the United States? It goes to the House of Representatives. And remember, what's true about the House of Representatives in 1860? Well, it's kind of all split over the map, but the southern states, because of the 3/5 compromise, have more seats in the House than they do registered voters, because 3/5 of African Americans are considered people for purposes of the distribution in the House. If it goes to the House, what's the chance that the House would choose a man to become the President of the United States who got less than 40% of the popular vote? Abraham Lincoln got 39.7% of the popular vote. Lincoln doesn't win New York, and there's a constitutional crisis instantaneously. Whether it leads to civil war or not, I don't know, but it leads to an enormous constitutional crisis. What prevents that? In my opinion, the United States Senator from New York sticks his neck out on October 28th, 1858 in Rochester and says, if you want abolition, if you want slavery to end, you must vote Republican. That's the only way to crush the Democratic Party and its allegiance with slavery. If you do it in New York and you vote Democratic in New York, you are empowering the slaveholders in other parts of the country, because they will look at New York and say, you're wishy-washy on the issue of slavery. You don't really care. I don't think it's any secret, but in 1860, New York City was a hotbed of pro-slavery activity. Hotbed. Why? Because all the financiers financed the cotton trade and the slave trade. You want to buy slaves? Well, we'll give you a mortgage on those slaves. We'll give you a mortgage on the property. New York City's Democrats were rabidly pro-slavery. It's only because of upstate New York and William Seward's speech 1 week before the 1858 election that he changes America's mind. A brilliant move by a brilliant guy. And why did he do it? Everybody says, well, it was designed to promote his presidential campaign. I don't think so. I think it had more to do with the political philosophy of the guy I mentioned at the start that I was going to ask you. Who's the guy that this speech fits perfectly when you got to think about what's going to happen in your hometown and in your local community? Who came up with that great phrase about what politics is? What? Tip O'Neill, Thomas P. O'Neill Jr. from Cambridge, Massachusetts. All politics is local. Seward goes to Rochester because that's where all the votes are. He comes to Western New York because they've all been voting for abolitionists, and he's got to convince them to vote for Republicans. And that's what the Irrepressible Conflict speech does, is it changes the mind of Western New Yorkers. It convinces the rest of the country that compromise on the issue of slavery is no longer possible, and that New York's, Western New York voters, your predecessors, were the ones who stood up and said, we can't compromise anymore. We've got to end the slave power in the United States. And it happens because Seward has the guts to say it, and because the people in the state of New York, in Western New York, had the guts to stand up and cast their votes that way. That's the importance of the Irrepressible Conflict speech. It's really all about, from my point of view, it's all about winning New York. It's all about winning his family and friends. Everyone says it cost him the presidency because he was declared to be a radical abolitionist, and therefore Lincoln could nose him out. I think that's true, but the courage of that speech is something that everybody from this community who has any association with this house ought to be incredibly proud of. It changed America forever. Thank you. I'd be glad to answer any questions if you have any based on all that. Just the final thing I want to mention, Seward and secession. I'll just clue it. This is, I think, my last time. Maybe I don't even have it. Just you ought to understand. No, I don't need it. I'll just explain it. It's real simple. Lincoln wins, and on the Hannibal Hamlin, the vice president, carries a letter from Lincoln to Seward on the 12th of December, 1860, and it says, you're going to be the next Secretary of State. 8 days later, South Carolina secedes. Why? Because they realized that the no-nonsense abolitionist William Henry Seward is going to be the Secretary of State, and that the Lincoln administration will no longer be pro-slavery. Seward is confirmed by the Senate on March 6th, 1861. What's interesting about that confirmation is there was very little dispute about it. Why was there very little dispute about elevating a radical abolitionist to the seat of Secretary of State? Why was there no dispute?
Compromise.
Nope.
Democrats were gone.
They were all gone. They had all left. They had seceded and moved out of the Senate. They, right. Well, South Carolina secedes in December, and then all of a sudden the Mississippi and these other states follow. And what they do is they call their delegation back from Washington. And what's interesting about it is they had a big question about whether they had a quorum. Right, a quorum of what? And they actually enacted a little rule which most people don't even know about. And that is, as soon as you declared you were seceded, you were no longer counted in the quorum. So that when they left, they suddenly realized they just needed a quorum of northern states. Seward is sworn into the job, of course, he takes the oath of office after he's confirmed by the Senate, and 5 weeks later, South Carolina fires on Fort Sumter, and the war begins. The bottom line from my point of view is Seward understood New York's fusion politics, and he was able to put it together in a very crafty way. Brilliant guy, brilliant politician, and he served our nation well. Questions? Sir?
Where was Auburn in the Western New York coalition?
Excuse me?
Where was Auburn in the Western New York coalition?
Well, it's interesting. Cayuga County had been voting abolitionist for a long period of time. But the fascinating thing from my point of view is once you get past Cayuga County, almost all those counties are very strong abolitionists. And I have a theory for that. Here's my theory. You're familiar with the burned over district, right? The tradition, Western New York, the home of Mormonism, the home of the Fox movement, the home of the Seance sisters. In the 1820s, in 1830s, there was a huge religious revival in Western New York that spawned Mormonism and all these religious sects and religious. They were fervently religious. And as a consequence, they made the move from everybody's a free man under God's eyes to everybody should be free. And whether you're black or white, you should be free. And the religious enthusiasm boils over into politics in Western New York. And it really leads to, this is why Frederick Douglass goes to Rochester, because he's convinced that's the place to be. Susan B. Anthony is there, although she's young. The Declaration of Sentiments is signed in 1848. As part of it, this is the revival in New York, happens in Western New York, and it starts really at the Syracuse line and moves west. The other interesting thing about it is, my secret about Western New York. Western New York is more Midwest than the Midwest. And there's a little secret. Why is that? Why would you say that? I'm a Rochester guy, right? Why would I say that? Well, when was the city of Rochester incorporated as a city? I'll make it easy. Before Detroit? Yes or no? No. Before St. Louis? No. Before Pittsburgh? No. Before Chicago? No. Rochester doesn't become a city until 1834. And Rochester is settled very late in the United States history. And why is that? Come on, somebody knows this. Jeff, come on, tell me why. Well, the Erie Canal is a very interesting idea, but it doesn't really have to do with the settlement. It's a post-settlement invention. Because what's the one thing missing in the geography in Western New York that every other state on the eastern seaboard has? It's missing one thing. No? What? A port. A port? Yeah. Well, what would you put at the mouth of a, what do you need for a port? New York State is the only state in the Union that does not have a river that flows west into the Mississippi. And as a consequence, the early settlers for Kentucky, Illinois, Indiana, they just jumped in a barge up in the top of the hills and floated down to the Mississippi. There's no river that flows west in New York. None. The Genesee flows north. We have lakes. We don't have a river flowing west. And therefore, getting here could only be done by land, which was much more expensive. Just jump in a boat and float down the river. You can get to Louisiana, for cripe's sakes. But the other reason why New York was slow to settle its western territory, there's one other reason, Jeff?
Slower to break up the big land tracts?
No. They had one other problem. Who lived here? And who were they? They were the Iroquois Confederation. In the American Revolution, who did the Iroquois support?
Depends.
Yeah, but they mostly side with the British. And so when America settled and the early fathers got together and said, where are we going to invest our westward expansion? We've got these rivers that flow to the Mississippi. Let's go. The Mississippi's a land of plenty. It's got all this stuff. The point of all this is in Western New York, which was settled late, you had religious fundamentalism, you had late settlers, second-generation settlers who came here, and as a consequence, they had an experience that I think was different from a lot of the people. Your forefathers came here, and they were just different, and they embraced the notion of true equality, that everybody should be created equal and everybody should have a right to vote. And that was true in the Declaration of Sentiments, it's true in the women's movement, it's true in the abolition movement, it's true in the temperance movement. I've done a lot of work on all of these areas, and Western New York is the center of the abolition movement in the United States. It becomes the center of the women's rights movement, Western New York. We forget our past at our peril, and we forget how important our forefathers were in all of these messages.
Weren't there a lot of Quakers in here as well?
Excuse me?
Weren't there a lot of Quakers?
There were lots of Quakers, lots of Quakers. The Post family in Rochester, Mary Post and Isaac Post were big abolitionists. The abolition movement, the Quakers were big on that. John Greenleaf Whittier was a Quaker. The poets in the middle of the 19th century. The Quakers and the religious sentiment brought abolition to the door of Western New York. Very much so. Any other questions? Sir?
You think Seward regretted giving the speech?
Regretted?
Yeah, giving the speech because they gave up his chance to become president.
No. No. I think he realized that if New York did not vote Republican in the 1860 election, his chance to become president was 0. And I honestly think that during the Republican convention in 1860, when he was the favorite walking in the door, I think there were serious questions asked about whether he could deliver New York. As pointed out in the slide which showed Lincoln's ability to deliver New York was by a relatively small handful. I think there were questions generally in the Republican Party about whether Seward could deliver New York. Turns out he did. And it turns out the reason why he did that was because he gave that speech. But I don't think he regretted it. I think he was satisfied to be the Secretary of State and preside in that job during the Civil War. He had a huge impact in the war. He had a huge impact on Lincoln. He helped Lincoln navigate his way through all kinds of issues with Congress, the draft and other things. Seward was a huge player in that process. Sir, you had a question.
That's somewhat of a controversial question. You mentioned James Buchanan, the president at the time, all this stuff going on. I heard or read that one of the reasons why he sympathized with the South was he had a romantic relationship with a Southern senator. The guy, he was the only...
Right, only bachelor, right.
And I was wondering, your research and all you were doing, did you see any evidence of that?
I have never explored that. Buchanan was an interesting character because Pennsylvania was an unusual state. There were large slaveholdings in Pennsylvania, in southern Pennsylvania. Maryland, as you know, was a swing state. It was a slave state. It did not secede. Delaware was led by a guy named Thomas Bayard, B-A-Y-A-R-D. He was the United States Senator from Delaware during the Civil War. He was a fervid anti-abolitionist. So I don't know about Buchanan's personal life, but Buchanan realized that the only way to elect a Democratic president in 1880 was to win New York. And he put a lot of effort in trying to bring the factions of the Democratic Party together in New York. Whether his personal life had anything to do with it, I would just point out that he is consistently ranked as the worst president in history. Largely.
I'm not sure about that.
What? I'm not going to say anything more. I'm just saying that Buchanan could not envision a solution to the slavery crisis and never proposed one. Other thoughts, comments? Again, let me thank Jeff and Walker for the invitation and for the board as well. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you all again so much for coming. We thank Judge Dollinger. If you're wondering, mark your calendars. The next installment in our Lunchtime Lecture series is July the 17th, right here at noon. It's American 250 and a former Seward House Museum staff member, Alyssa Morris, who now works at Montpelier. We'll talk about when Seward described himself as a young man as Madisonian. What did that mean, and how did he break from that mold? We hope to see you there, as well as July 3rd this Friday, right here in the Gardens with our own Mr. Seward, and July 16th with us. Thank you all.